Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Thanks so much for having me.
Set the table for us. Give us a quick intro. Who exactly are you?
Sure. So my name's Alex Halperin. I'm a journalist. I've been covering the cannabis industry for a bit more than 5 years. And I started the media company, WeedWeek, and we publish a couple of newsletters, original reporting, and a bunch of different things to sort of cover the industry in an editorially independent way.
Okay, you got to give me more than that, man. What's WeedWeek all about then? Like what exactly?
Sure.
It's a platform that does journalistic projects, podcasts, everything. Can you kind of paint a picture?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have a bunch of different offerings. We have 3 newsletters, WeedWeek, which I write, WeedWeek California, and WeedWeek Canada. Each of those focused on those markets respectively. We publish original reporting. We had a podcast for a while. We recently put it on hiatus, but much of our archive is also online on the site at weedweek.net. Got some great interviews there. And then we publish as well some resources for professionals in the industry. So, for example, I just wrote the WeedWeek Guide to the California cannabis industry, which is free at the site. And but mainly, so that's what WeedWeek does every week. But I would say that what we're about is our sort of guiding sentiment is that, we like to get high. That's fine. Not necessarily everyone at WeedWeek, but certainly some of us. But we say that the least interesting thing about marijuana is what happens after you smoke it. And we focus on the politics, the business, the health and science, the criminal justice and social justice, and then culture as well. Because essentially what legalization, it touches on so many of the fault lines in American life, I think, in interesting ways. And we try and look at some of those things as well. I mean, it touches on the fault lines in Canadian life as well. But those fault lines aren't quite as pronounced these days anyway. But, certainly Jesse Staniforth, who writes WeedWeek Canada from Montreal, definitely focuses on all these different issues, which are so fascinating as this industry takes this, more or less unprecedented trip from sort of the shadows into the mainstream.
When I started this podcast, my interest was investing in cannabis stocks primarily. So I was really going after like business related interviews and stuff. But I learned over time that you can't really escape culture when it comes to cannabis. Like no matter what, it plays such a big part in the overall picture, and in the business as well. Culture is there. So it's nice to talk to people sometimes about what they do from a business perspective, but get a bit of that sort of personalized perspective thrown in there as well. The culture side of it, I guess you could say. You can't really get out of that part.
Absolutely. I mean, we cover the business a lot, but it's more sort of the stories. We don't look at the stocks that much. I mean, I'm sort of glad to not be anywhere near the stocks right now. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't really tell you a really granular sort of investor's look at this company versus that company.
Oh yeah,
and which one is the most promising. And I certainly couldn't in Canada. Jesse could probably do a better job of that than I.
I don't think that there are a lot of people who really can. There's a lot of people who imply that they can. And if you looked at my stock portfolio, you would know right away that I probably shouldn't be talking stocks either. Sometimes I say on Twitter, somebody will put like, all you ACB bag holders out there. And I'm like, it's not that people are bag holders. It's that you can't get out. You're so underwater. You're just like, you're not being stubborn. You're just being like, well, what do I do at this point? I'll just play the long game, right? The long game. Hey, you were a journalist before, outside of the cannabis realm. So why did you get into cannabis?
So I'm a business journalist largely. My last job was as news editor at the website Salon. But I've written a lot about healthcare, technology, finance, fracking. And I was freelancing in New York and Fast Company sent me to MJBizCon. This was in November 2014, which then is now was the largest sort of all the industry gatherings. And of course, I've been to God knows how many since. But what struck me, so it was about 3,500 people in Las Vegas. And I thought, this is an amazing story and nobody's covering it. And I should cover it. So not too long after that, I moved to Denver, and I was there for about a year and a half, which was then sort of the center of the commercial cannabis world. And then California legalized, and I moved on to LA.
Okay.
But that's sort of how, but basically, I guess I sort of assumed that eventually maybe somebody would hire me as their reporter. But I think it says something about the state of the news biz, but also the biases of the news biz, that this is not a story which has received as much attention as I think it deserves in the mainstream media.
It's weird, isn't it? Cannabis. On the one hand, and our I guess experience in Canada, although you have legalization in California prior to Canada federally, but my experience has been that prior to legalization, the hype was just nuts here. We had reporters that were dedicated to the cannabis beat in newspapers, multiple magazines opening up, multiple podcasts. It was like everybody's on it. And then after legalization, and especially when the business started to slow and people started to lose money, all of a sudden, a lot of people, I think, turned their backs, or maybe they couldn't afford to be as invested in cannabis media anymore. And it really changed. And I guess that leads me to my question for you. What's the vibe like in California? Like, I know California has cannabis culture up the yin-yang, just like BC does here. And but what's it like as a journalist in California or in the US? What's the vibe like overall? Is it still picking up like we experienced in Canada a couple of years ago?
Well, it's different in every state. I mean, one of my favorite things to talk about is that Oklahoma, where they famously don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee, now they have only medical marijuana, but it's very loosely regulated. And they have, with 10% of the population and obviously far more conservative cultural milieu, they have 3 times as many dispensaries as California. So really, every state is different. So in California, I think it's the world's biggest market, but it's also among the most challenging to make a living, to run a profitable business. And because of the federal illegality, I think the fundamental truth, the sort of fundamental dynamic of the cannabis industry is that there's tremendous demand and it's still extremely hard to run a profitable business. And this seems to be true in Canada as well, where the federal illegality isn't even an issue. So whether or not your people are able to make money, I think dictates a lot of the mood about what's going on. I mean, right now in California, the illegal market still accounts for 2/3 of sales because taxes are high, and still a huge amount of the state cities and counties and such don't allow cannabis business. So as a result, the illegal market serves them. So right now, with the pandemic, things have changed a bit. Everything's changed. Whereas, cannabis in almost everywhere it was illegal was designated an essential business, and sales are up, and there's there are a lot of plans to sort of legalize in the short term in various, like New York was probably going to legalize this year, and Connecticut was going to legalize this year. So those have been put on hold. But there's a lot of optimism about the medium to long term, both from cannabis getting this essential status and from the sort of the assumption that everybody's going to be broke and desperate for cannabis taxes. But in the short term, there's a lot of pain because even though sales are up, businesses have had to really struggle and spend a lot of money to adapt to social distancing protocols and stuff like that. And also just the industry wasn't eligible for federal relief, which, virtually every other industry was.
Going back to your comment about the legacy market, same thing here in Canada, of course. I think there's still more cannabis being purchased from legacy dealers than legal. And I'm a big proponent of supporting the legal market because I want it to survive. I want it to be successful. But man, it's hard to find good weed that can compete with some of the stuff you can buy from people that Like price is one thing, and then quality. It's still not there. We used to always talk to these large-scale growers, when we're all investing and super excited about making money. And, they would always brag about how large their facilities, how much output they have. And now we realize that doesn't mean shit if your product is crap. Really?
Yeah. We don't really have those sort of quality issues that have been so persistent in Canada. And I'm no connoisseur, and I'm sure there are some connoisseurs who would say that, the illegal stuff is better and stuff like that. But I don't really hear too much about it. I think so it's an interesting question, though, is why Canada has struggled so much with quality. Is it because it's not just because they're growing in these big warehouses? They do that here too.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty deep question you can spend a lot of time talking about. But you know what? The one saving grace, I think, in Canada anyway, is that slowly but surely some of these craft cannabis growers are legitimizing, and their products are starting to hit the market. And now there's a better variety, and it's creating an equilibrium too. Like the prices had to come down to match the legacy market. Had to. And now these, Aurora Cannabis has this, I can't remember what the correct term for it is, it's like street weed or something they call it, and it's $5 a gram. And that's more realistic because the street weed is Aurora's weed is like street weed. So you may as well tell it like it is and sell it at that kind of price. And it makes more sense now, which leads me to my point. Somebody gave me an eighth of Legacy a week ago, and I was like, shit, I forgot how good weed can be sometimes. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, sure.
What are your predictions then for federal? I ask every American I interview. It's impossible to say, isn't it?
So in the latest relief bill, I don't know, the third or fourth or whatever, the House once again passed by a bipartisan vote safe banking, which would, and I think it's pretty safe to say banking is going to happen before legalization, certainly with the current makeup of Congress. In the response from Senate Republicans, they were all railing, and Mitch McConnell especially was railing about essentially Democrats wanting to put some money into cannabis equity, which is sort of the movement to say that minority communities should receive some support to be able to participate in this industry, which, is sort of a nice idea that some places are endorsing in certain ways, but it hasn't really worked out. There aren't too many success stories so far.
Minority communities?
Like Black and brown communities.
Yep,
who were most oppressed during the war on drugs. There's some in LA and Massachusetts, there are laws designed to support entrepreneurs from those communities, but it's a very hard problem to solve, and there's not a lot of success so far. So anyway, that was a bit of a tangent, but anyway, so Mitch McConnell spent all his time banging on about that, but he didn't really have any issue with the safe banking, and there are some Republicans who are pretty much who are openly supportive of safe banking. And I've sort of argued that Republicans in the marijuana industry are natural allies as soon as sort of Republicans are ready for it. The former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, is now a cannabis pitchman. Mitch McConnell has met privately with cannabis industry professionals. And I don't say this is some sort of conspiracy or something like that, but for the same reasons that the alcohol industry and the tobacco industry and food and pharmaceuticals, all these industries, they don't like regulation and stuff like that. Their Republicans are there natural political home, at least as far as their economic self-interest goes, which I think pretty much rules the day in the cannabis industry.
Well,
so I could see banking potentially happening this year. That's sort of an unpopular view. And the difference between, that would be such an enormous step forward for the industry. I think that almost the rest of it would be sort of a token gesture. Yeah. Once that happens, it would, and I think it could potentially, I'm not going to say it will happen, but I think it could happen this year. And the one thing that I think is stopping it, a majority of Republicans support legalization consistently, but there remains an influential bloc within the Republican Party that is very averse to it. And that includes sort of very conservative people, very religious people, and then also largely sort of the talking heads that the president pays attention to on Fox News.
Your wild card, though, really is Donald Trump, because on the one hand, I think he likes to pander to the religious element for sure. I don't think he's a religious guy, but there's a religious element to his public speaking all of a sudden, and I think it's good for the vote. But on the other hand, love him or hate him, he does seem like somebody who, if he identifies opportunity for the U.S., he would probably support it. So that's weird to me. Like, I can't put a finger on him in terms of legalization. Would he do it in his second term once he's, if he's reelected? Maybe he feels safer. But that's, I think in the U.S., that's the one Trump piece that, for cliche, lack of a better term, that I can't figure out.
So if I may, if I interrupted.
No, I had two other points. You do your thing. I'll do mine. You go ahead.
Well, the one thing I would say about Trump, there are definitely people, I've definitely heard people say, oh, Trump is going to legalize to get reelected. And I just don't think that's true. I don't think it's something that is on his radar. And a lot of the people he pays attention to on Fox News, Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, they're very hostile to legalization, not for any coherent reason that I'm aware of, but just sort of trafficking in stereotypes and stuff like that. And I think the president's sort of information feedback loop is sort of pretty limited in a lot of ways. And I just don't think it's something that he's thinking about. Or, there have been one or two tapes of like people bringing up the banking issue with him, and he really just doesn't seem to care. And it's not something I don't think he's ever tweeted about, or almost never tweeted about. It just seems out of his vision.
Yeah. I think we are so engulfed in cannabis talk that we just assume naturally that leaders of countries are also, but maybe not. The 2 points I wanted to make prior were same thing happening in Canada, where politicians and public figures who had previously opposed cannabis and, police chiefs who arrested people and all that are totally involved in cannabis companies here. And I have to choose my words carefully here. On the one hand, cannabis culture hates that. On the other hand, put yourself in their shoes, business people trying to make money. You can't blame them. I don't support them, but you can't blame them for trying to get into the game now that it's legal here. And second was to your comment about minorities in the U.S., and that's why I clarified with you. I don't know if you're familiar with what's happening in Mexico, but they're pushing a bill forward to do some form of legalization as well. It's on hold right now because of COVID, but one of the stipulations in their bill is that they're going to give advantages and access to business to people in communities that have been affected by cartel in previous years, which I thought was an interesting consideration to do in a legalization bill.
I hadn't heard that, but I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, it's similar to what you were saying. It's just, affected by the cartel. And I'm sure I haven't lived in Mexico, but I've been to lots of beaches there. I'm sure there's been a lot of people there that have been negatively affected by the crime there because you hear so much about it anyway.
Of course.
What's your game plan for Weed Week then? Now you're established. You've been in the cannabis journalism game for 5 years. You've got Weed Week Canada. Obviously, you're keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening here for Americans. You had a podcast that's on hold, but you've got publications coming out all the time, stories. So, sort of, what's the big picture goal with Weed Week?
Sure. I mean, we want to be a sustainable media company. Right now, we want to be sort of the leading source of credible news about the fastest growing industry in North America. So right now we're publishing original reporting and analysis daily. We've got 3 newsletters. I think Jesse's Weed Week Canada newsletter, which comes out on Wednesday, is really peerless sort of overview of what happened in the Canadian weed world in the past weeks. I really recommend folks check it out, and it's free at weedweek.net. I think create a company that is a fair and objective, but just be sort of a leading voice of credible cannabis news and information.
Nice.
Is our goal.
It's a tough. It's a tough field to cover. I know from podcasting, it's tough to monetize it, really, because I find that your listener base is super pigeonholed, right? And sometimes, and I've had conversations with other podcasters in Canada who we all kind of specialize in the cannabis game, and we're all like, we got to sort of diversify a little bit, so open it up to other people, because if it's just cannabis all the time, you definitely have a smaller pool of people in which to pull from.
Psychedelics.
Well, that's all the new thing, right? Legalization's out of the way. Let's get into psychedelics now. Yeah, and even those are popping up. There's new psychedelic podcasts. And cool. I'm not going to personally go heavy duty into psychedelics because I feel like I'm so invested in cannabis. And now, I'll let someone else take that lead. How do we find out about Weed Week? Where do we get you? You had mentioned, obviously, weedweek.net online. Yeah,
and we're on Twitter and Instagram at Weed Week News, and LinkedIn and Facebook also at Weed Week News, I think.
Beauty. Any final thoughts? Anything I missed?
No. Thanks so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, brother. Take care.
All right. Take care.